All right, well thank you very much for coming to hear my little talk about the Flying Tiger line. I think they're an interesting airline, really unique in so many ways, and we'll crack through and find out all the ways that they are unique. The airline started, its origins are in World War II with the American Volunteer Group, which was, as it sounds, taken from different branches of the US military to fight the Japanese in the defense of China before Pearl Harbor, in fact. They flew, they had 16 Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighter planes with the distinctive shark's teeth. They were actually the first fighting group to land a punch on Japan after Pearl Harbor, because they were already in theatre and already fighting. After World War II ended, 10 AVG pilots came together to create National Skyways, a cargo airline. Their financial contribution was matched by the Californian oil tycoon Samuel B. Mosher. Their first airplane, they bought 14 war surplus Budd Conestogas. Budd, based in New England, they made railway cars. And the Conestoga, as far as I'm aware, was the only airplane that they built, and it was made of stainless steel. Only 20 built, and 14 of them ended up with what was then called National Skyways. I think it's a hilarious looking airplane. I mean, it just looks horrendous. And I mean, I don't think Tigers had any fatal accidents with them, but they certainly did work their way through a few. I know one ended up crashing in a graveyard in Detroit. And the first officer left, the signal was never seen again. But that's enough flying for me. They started out in Long Beach, but quickly moved to an airfield called Mines Field, which you know as LAX. The Budd Conestoga only lasted about a year. It was quickly replaced by the DC-3 and the C-54, which was, and also the C-46, Curtiss C-46 Commando, which I always think is an interesting airplane, the C-46, because it has the proportions of a DC-3, but it's actually quite a bit bigger and heavier and faster, and also a lot harder to fly, a lot less forgiving compared to the good old DC-3. A lot of the early flying was obviously military contracts, but really everything. I mean, this is a classic sort of fly-by-night, post-war freight carrier. They flew fruit, furniture, football teams. They moved Bob Hope's record collection. They even flew Roy Rogers' horse, Trigger. And right from the beginning, they were doing long-haul flying, including trips to Europe and trips to Asia. Really, flying everything. I'm stumbling here slightly. The correct form is anything, anywhere, anytime, including a lot of passenger flying. A pal of ours here, Marshall, flew with the Flying Tigers as a passenger in 1947 as an 8-year-old boy, all the way to Europe. I wonder, Marshall, would you like to share any of your experience of flying as an 8-year-old unaccompanied child to France with the Flying Tigers?
The main reason Charlie wants me here is I'm the oldest living relic that was around in 1945 when Tigers was formed. Bob Prescott came to Washington, D.C. because Sam Mosher said he had to get his lawyer's approval. He showed up in April of '45, called my father, who was a lawyer for Sam Mosher. My father had no idea what this was all about and had to stall till he could call California and find out what it was about. And Sam's comment was, I didn't think they'd ever raise the money. Do it and build it. As a result, my father became first lawyer and one of the founders of the airline. I met Bob in '45 in April. He came to our house the day after my father met him for dinner. And 3 years later, when I was 8, the phone rang, like a brat. I was talking to Bob, where's your father? He's upstairs. I kept listening. Bob says, I got a treat for Marshall. I wanted to fly on the first flight to take racehorses back to the UK after the war in June of '47. So we took 3 racehorses back and brought back the first 48 Greek immigrants, all in bucket seats in a C-54. In those days, you had to rent the C-54 pilots by the trip because they're all ex-military and there were really very few of them available. During the trip, the crew had to take this 8-year-old, I was technically a crew member, and take me in each of the cities sightseeing. When we got to Paris, I couldn't leave an 8-year-old alone in the Follies, so I went to the Follies. In my diary, I recorded, just got back from the Follies, Chuck is going out to meet some young French girls. I had no idea what I was writing then. Subsequently, I became a lawyer in my father's firm and represented Tigers into the late 60s. And then I jumped ship and represented other airlines and ultimately shippers. So I've spent, because of that, my entire life in aviation.
Amazing. Thank you, Bob.
Oh, by the way, we did form this historical society. You can pick up these over at Charlie's table. We're really talking about a virtual museum online on the history of the airline. So join with us in helping to preserve the history of the first all-cargo airline in the United States. Thank you.
It's amazing. It's a different world. Imagine taking an 8-year-old unaccompanied to strip clubs in Paris, and then having her on the gen deck as crew. Oh, I must have left it too long. Can we maybe just?
There you go.
Oh, we're back. Yeah. So yeah, some beautiful piston planes there. But it's it's worth noting that Flying Tigers always carried a lot of passengers, and we'll touch on that more in a little bit. I was talking to John, another Tiger here in the house, John Dixon, ex Flying Tiger 747 captain. And it was interesting that John, you said that because to me and in history, I think the Flying Tigers it's the Pan Am of cargo, incredibly impressive operation. But John, you said that maybe people didn't understand the airline, but that Flying Tigers were often excluded from industry organizations, industry membership, and even when crew would show up, it was like, oh, the circus is here.
Yeah.
And I think maybe because of the reliance on cargo and all these other sort of very patrician sort of Pan Am and TWA, probably for them I think cargo was a bit of a sort of an afterthought, and they didn't really understand it. So it's funny that I think Flying Tigers were always probably kind of misfits and outsiders compared to some of the competition. So when they moved from LAX to Burbank in when would that have been? About 1949, I think. They moved to Burbank, which is where Lockheed were based and were building the Constellation. So the shortest imaginable delivery of new aircraft. You'll see a Tiger Girl in the cockpit there. I think the airline always seems to like having beautiful girls around. I wish I had more evidence of that for you. So they graduated to the beautiful Super Constellation, which is just such a magnificent airplane. And every cross section has every frame has a different cross section. This airplane does not have a right angle anywhere on it. The Connies were, I think, difficult to load because everything has to go through a fairly small door. So the Connies stuck around, but it was in Well, let me just stick with the Connies for a little bit longer. There's one all the way over in Gatwick. See if we've got the CL-44 up next. Yes, we do. So it wasn't long before the CL-44 came along, which is, I think, probably not a well-known aeroplane. There was only 39 built by Canadair in Montreal. It's a stretched version of the Bristol Britannia. And there was only a tiny handful of customers. Flying Tiger Line, Seaboard World, Slick Airways, and the Canadian Air Force, who called it the CC-106 Yukon. And that was it, 39 built, all freighters except for Lofladir, the Icelandic carrier, and I've got a picture of them coming up. But incredibly beautiful airplane. But really the special sauce was the swing tail, and you can see even a German F-104 Starfighter being loaded into the airplane. So that vastly reduced turnaround times compared to the Constellation, and vastly increased aircraft utilization. So a very important airplane for the Flying Tigers. I've always been a gigantic fan because I think it's a beautiful looking airplane, the proportions, and also I like the fact that it has sort of the ram's horn yoke, like a Concorde. I think the Brits were really into this for a while because I think the Trident had a ram's horn as well. It's not really relevant, but I wanted to just put one picture in of a CL-44 in passenger configuration because it looks incredibly modern. In fact, it was the first airplane to have enclosed overhead lockers instead of hat racks. But it looks like a semi-modern airliner to me. But what's interesting is if you looked out the window of this airplane, there's 4 gigantic propellers. It looks like a jet. Talking to some of the retired Flying Tigers at the pilots' reunions, I've said to them, gosh, what a beautiful airplane, it must have been so nice to fly. And one guy said, this thing vibrated so much that some of our boys had dental problems. So the jet age was not far behind. In fact, the CL-44 was turbine powered. Actually, you know, I'm just going to go back briefly just to the props before we move on to the jet age, just to make the point about how different safety records were in those days. And in 1962, Tigers actually lost 4 Constellations in fatal crashes, 2 within 24 hours. One of them is an interesting one. The 23rd of September 1962, they ditched 800 miles west of Ireland in the dark, and only lost 28 passengers out of 76. So they had 48 survivors ditching a Connie in the middle of the Atlantic in the night, which is incredible. And I think they were helicoptered onto a ship, and the ship took them to Ireland, and they were flown back to the United States on a Sabena 707. You know, I think again it was a different age and with different expectations. There were, 2 CL-44s were lost also in accidents just in one year in 1966. Anyway, in 1963 they moved back to LAX from Burbank because Burbank is just too short for big jets, and the 707 arrived in 1965. 4 aircraft. Let's see if we've got. So what's the most interesting 707 trip, I think, for Tigers was the Polecat in November 1965, starting in Palm Springs, but basically flew around the world via both poles, from Honolulu to Honolulu via London, London to the North Pole, let me start that again, Honolulu, North Pole to London, London to Buenos Aires via Lisbon, and then from Buenos Aires to Christchurch in New Zealand via the South Pole, and then back to Honolulu. And that was a world record, 62 hours and 27 minutes, door to door, Honolulu to Honolulu, via both poles. So even though it was obviously a very beautiful airplane and a fantastic airplane, my 70 is my favourite, it only lasted 4 years because Douglas had the DC-8-63 coming. So just a couple of quick looks at the 70 before we get there. That's on the ramp at LAX, obviously, but a very different LAX. Non-standard cheat line on that 707 there because it's just come back from the lease to El Al, where they were doing some flying because El Al pilots were on strike. So again, you can see some of the flying that Tiger was doing, not just cargo but passengers as well, and unusual trips. I think this is, well, I'm going with Korean War orphans for a reunion. Obviously, and famously, one of the Tiger 707s was in the movie Airport, the original Airport, with Dean Martin and Burt Lancaster. So that's the Golden Argosy there. But the DC-8-63 stretch carried much more payload than a 707 and could go a bit further. They started with 1 in June '68 and quickly ramped up to a fleet of 18 DC-8-63s in time for the Vietnam War, where Tigers did a lot of flying. In actual fact, they did a lot of flying for the Korean War as well, but Vietnam especially with the DC-8. And not just, I think that was, that true movement didn't just drive growth at Tigers, but I think also Seaboard, American Flyers, and some of those other freight names from the day. So there we are on the ramp, in fact, in Saigon. Some kind of unusual payload. And the cabin crew sunning themselves between trips. And there's a really nice slice of life on the way to or from the theatre of combat. And a classic aircraft interior. Looking, I would say, even maybe less modern than the CL-44. There you go. A couple more on the ramp there. Tigers were always looking for new business opportunities. They had a share of a record company called Happy Tiger. I think there was even a chain of restaurants, or at least a restaurant, Hungry Tiger, and a venture into corporate flying with BAC 111, or even I think 2 BAC 111s. In the mid-70s, this is not as out of sequence as it might appear, in the mid-70s they finally built a proper dedicated corporate headquarters, which is the white building at the top behind the hangar there. That's called, it was called High Tiger. You can see the balcony at the top. That was outside the executive suite, and it's still there today. Today that building belongs to the Los Angeles Airports Authority, which I think is pronounced LAWA. And I think that building is used mostly for security and issuing the IDs and running the airport security out of there. But it's nice to see it's still there.
Where is it located?
Well, it's a very good question. I'm not, well, it's sort of midfield, I think, is it not?
No, it's at the west end of the airport. It's
Roadway West.
Off 24 left on Roadway West. The backstory, I'm sorry if I...
Please, no, please.
That hangar there was the largest cantilever-style maintenance hangar west of Atlanta for a number of years. Obviously, FedEx used it up until...
And that was the Flying Tigers hangar.
That was Flying Tigers hangar. And then, unfortunately, FedEx has given up their lease to use that whole property, and they're going to tear that hangar down.
And that's right now. I mean, they literally cleared out like 2 months ago.
They haven't taken the crane to it. Right now, they're just using it for... But that whole area of LAX will now be for satellite parking for airliners. They've already started using that area just to the west of that picture towards the ocean. But the only thing that's keeping other development is the fuel tanks over there, which have not been in service for years and years and years, but have contaminated the earth underneath. And so, of course, the environmentalists are all up in arms. You can't build anything over there for a long time until they mitigate that problem. So, sorry.
No, it's super interesting. So, in 1974, Flying Tigers got their first jumbo. It's an ex-American Airlines 747-123 with a side cargo door. Let's see, so just a couple of jumbos. You can see that it's, from the finish, that it's had paint removed, and we'll see later what a freshly delivered 747-200 looks like without paint. This is Bob Prescott, who we've been mentioning. So he was the founder and the CEO from 1945 until until he left us in 1978. A very charismatic leader, who really drove the growth and success of the company. And just after he died, the first new 747 was delivered, Series 249, from the Boeing factory, and named the Robert Prescott in his memory. So brand new jumbos, and then shortly after that was the merger with Seaboard World. I've got a couple of pictures of them to show, just because I think it's such a smart livery. It's such a fantastic looking livery. That one obviously in JFK, with the Afternoon British Airways just coming in behind it. Seaboard had a similar trajectory, I think possibly a little bit less exotic than Flying Tigers, but nonetheless founded in '46, with sort of a DC-4 Constellation, DC-8 Vietnam trajectory. But there was sort of the East Coast version, based in New York, while Tigers was really based in LA. But as Tigers flew the Atlantic, Seaboard World also did do Pacific flying. But to bring in that Eastern focus really made the Tigers a global operation. And just a couple more pictures of that beautiful livery. That's quite a famous one, I think, from Boeing pre-delivery. And there's one just after the merger. By the way, the engines, those are actually Pratt & Whitney JT9Ds, but they look like CF6s because it's a 70A. Those engines are JT9D 70A with these gigantic cowlings, and very unusual. I think only a few of them were built like that. So yeah, a very eventful time with the new jumbos, the Seaboard merger. And in 1981, Metro International was created as a dedicated passenger operation. Not actually with Tiger jumbos. They bought a separate fleet of 747s from Singapore Airlines. The original set jumbos delivered to Singapore went to Metro. And this ran for about 2 years, doing some scheduled flying across the Atlantic and charter flying. After 2 years, it was sold to a New Jersey travel agent called Tower Travel. And this airline, I can tell from the snort of recognition, became Tower Air. Tigers kept doing amazing, incredible stuff. In 1985, even flew the torch of the Statue of Liberty to Los Angeles to be used in the Rose Bowl parade in Pasadena. Having said that about having a good and eventful early 80s, the airline was struggling without Prescott, I think, and the industry was changing a lot. The early DC-8s were sold by Flying Tigers, but then they were sold to competing airlines who were so they were kind of enabling their competition with the DC-8s that they sold on to other carriers. Just looking at some of the other 80s, flying obviously a big military role. But really, anything, anytime, anywhere, obviously oversized stuff that looks like maybe possibly related to the oil industry. I know they flew for bands, they flew for a James Bond movie, all the cameras and stuff, and a couple of helicopters in a James Bond movie. Are we in LAX here? Actually, there's Kennedy.
No one.
Oh yeah, what am I saying? Of course, I forgot about saying. That's JFK, isn't it? Let's see. That's JFK also. I'm looking for my FedEx slide. I wonder if, because of the format of the picture, it's not going to appear. I think, yeah, we're not going to get the FedEx slide. But another classic case where in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia here, Flying Tigers flew most of the relief and aid that was paid for by the record We Are the World, USA for Africa. And I think in the next picture, do we have it? No? Oh, there's anyway, there we are in Addis, bringing in aid for the Ethiopian famine. There's a change of corporate branding there going on with the two different tail designs. The T was the earlier one, I think.
Yeah. T was the earlier one.
T was the earlier
and then they went to the Flying Tiger one, and then they went back to the T.
They did go back to the T.
To save the airline by using an old brand.
Yeah, right. I'm just going to quickly introduce FedEx, who are going to play a big role in a minute. FedEx started in Little Rock in 1971 by Fred Smith with a fleet of Falcons, yes. With the idea of a hub and spoke network for urgent deliveries. It was originally created as a term paper in business school. His professor didn't agree, didn't approve. They moved to Memphis and by 1983 had a revenue of over $1 billion. And $1 billion revenue without having done any mergers or acquisitions. It was entirely organic growth. So this was the new competition, and it was making life difficult. Flying Tigers tried to keep up. They created a hub and spoke cargo network of their own, based out of Columbus, Ohio, Rickenbacker, with a fleet of ex-American Airlines 727-100s. Let me see what else we've got here. But yeah, the airline was struggling. The airline was struggling against more nimble and modern competition. And Stephen Wolf was brought in. He was an executive who was at American Airlines from 1966 to 81. He did a year at Pan Am and then a short stint as the president of Continental. But I think what he's most famous for is his mergers, and in 1984 he became CEO of Republic Airlines. And I think his job at Republic was to oversee the merger with Northwest, which was done. And then when he was appointed CEO of Flying Tigers, I think again it was to prepare the airline ultimately for a merger, which came in December '87. An offer was made, and the merger was consummated on the 7th of August 1989. At the time, the FedEx, the Flying Tigers fleet was 8 747-100s, 13 747-200s, 19 727s, and 6 DC-873s. And I think what's notable there is the size of the small size of the airline. I don't have the comparable numbers, unfortunately. I thought I did. But just to compare that to the size of FedEx, let me see if I have that on my notes, because it's really worthy of comparison. That and I don't have it. But I think FedEx right now is 60 777s, 90 767s, 113 757s. Even to my surprise, they've still got 40 MD-11s and something like 60 A300s. So, you know, I mean, an airline like Flying Tiger was like a flying club next to these monsters. And I think that's one of the things we've really seen change over the years. When you look at the kind of orders that airlines would place, there'd be like 5. Oh, we've sold 5 Convair 990s, and it's a major triumph. And now it's hundreds at a time. It's hundreds at a time. FedEx was a domestic-only operator, pretty much close enough. There was a few international flights. In fact, even went to Heathrow, I think. But it was a domestic operation, and so Flying Tigers was incredibly valuable for the international route licenses, slots in places, far-off slots like Narita, Hong Kong, Kai Tak, so it was the merger with Flying Tigers that made FedEx a global operator. As an aside, we remember the original FedEx livery. It could be apocryphal, but it might be true that Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx, was given a number of options for a livery, and he famously chose the one that he thought was the ugliest, because he thought if it's really ugly, then it'll really stand out. And I think it's a fantastic livery. It was so smart, especially on a jumbo. Only one Flying Tigers jumbo was actually painted in that livery, but God, I think it looks so good. And there it is flying into the sunset. The jumbo stayed with flying. The DC-8s only lasted about a year or two. The jumbo stayed until almost the end of the 90s. So just in conclusion, I wanted to make the point, actually probably could have done it earlier, but just how much passengers flying FedEx did, which were, to make the point, I think it was possibly in the early 50s, Flying Tigers was the 3rd biggest US carrier for passenger numbers across the Atlantic, 3rd only to Pan Am and TWA. So an extraordinary and unique carrier. As the publisher of Astral Horizon Press, it's been an honor for me to work with the Flying Tigers and publish actually 5 books about their history, starting with the book about the DC-8 and the Flying Tiger line, which we did, me and my pal Guy, we did to raise money to rescue the original DC-8 simulator of Flying Tigers, which was rotting away in a barn in Kansas. It was in Kansas, so that's where we are. The Tiger retirees took us to their heart and shared their stories and their archives with us, and it's led to not 4 but actually 5 books, but volume 2 of the archives is just about sold out. So it's been a real journey for me and my co-writer, my co-author Guy, to put this history into print. As well as these books, I also chose Flying Tigers as a topic to talk about here, because John and Marshall have, as Marshall told you, have started the Flying Tigers, Flying Tiger Line Historical Society. I wonder if either of you would like to, maybe you covered it, but if there's anything else you'd like to add. except that,
Just, we have just an absolute passion for continuing the legacy and the history of the Flying Tiger line. And because we had most of our archives stored in that maintenance hangar that FedEx graciously allowed us to keep, that we got kicked out of last year, we decided to start a historical society, which we have done. If you want to learn more about us and the Flying Tiger line, your best bet is to buy the books. But,
he's right about that.
But if you want to go a little cheaper route, we do have a website. If you can remember, Flying Tiger Line Historical Society, FTLHS. We have pamphlets. Unfortunately, I forgot to bring them. But come by his table later on, and we'll give you one. But it's a free site to the public, and you'll learn a lot more. We have an enormous amount of content still to get up on the website, but that will come with time. There's only the 5 of us, Marshall and I, and 3 other dedicated, actually 4 other dedicated former employees of the Flying Tiger Line. So, and
is that the new office, or is that in a hangar?
that's the new office. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Still
So
in LA?
still in Los Angeles. Yes.
Where is it?
It's this office is in about 3 miles northeast of LAX in an office building. It's actually a much better place for us. And now we're, of course, trying to raise the money to start digitizing the enormous amount of pictures, files, and 16mm film and everything else. So that content will be a work in progress for the next 2 or 3 years. But in the meantime, if you want to learn more about the Flying Tiger line and our passion for this airline, then go to www.ftlhs.org, come by and get a pamphlet, and buy the books.
Yeah. Thank you, John. And to be clear, those filing cabinets are all full.
Yeah, oh
Yes.
yeah, chocolate.
Not organized.
So that's the story of the Flying Tiger line, and I really appreciate you listening. Thank you so much.
Okay.